Jack Miller woke with a start, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The nightmare had returned. Jungles, gunfire, faces of men long gone. Sweat soaked his sheets despite the cool mountain air flowing through the open window of his cabin. 50 years since Vietnam, and still the dreams came. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his right knee protested. Shrapnel from a landmine outside Khe Sanh had left its permanent mark. Jack reached for the worn wooden cane propped against his nightstand, a gift he'd carved himself during those first difficult years after returning home. That's when he heard it, an insistent sound from outside. Not the usual forest noises he'd grown accustomed to in his 20 years of self-imposed isolation, but something different, something with purpose. The sound of hooves striking earth. Jack limped to the window, squinting into the dawnlight. There, at the edge of the small clearing surrounding his cabin, stood a wild Mustang. The horse was magnificent, muscular and proud with a chestnut coat that gleamed like polished copper in the early morning sun. But it was the animal's eyes that captured Jack's attention, intelligent, almost human in their intensity as they stared directly at him. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, reaching for his flannel shirt. By the time he made it to the porch, he half expected the Mustang to be gone, a hallucination brought on by too little sleep and too many memories. But the horse remained, standing motionless except for the occasional swish of its tail. "Where'd you come from, boy?" Jack called out, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke aloud anymore, having few visitors this far up the mountain. As if in response, the Mustang pawed the ground once, then turned and walked several paces toward the dense forest before stopping to look back at Jack. The message couldn't have been clearer if the animal had spoken. "Follow me." Jack hesitated. He hadn't ventured far from his cabin in years, preferring the safety of his solitude to the complications of the outside world. But something about the Mustang's gaze tugged at him, awakening a curiosity he thought long dead. "This is crazy," he muttered, but he was already going back inside for his jacket and canteen. Almost as an afterthought, he grabbed the old .45 from its box under his bed and tucked it into his belt. Old habits from a war that had ended decades ago, but still raged inside his head. The horse waited patiently, its ears pricked forward when Jack emerged again. "All right then," he said, settling his worn Vietnam veteran cap on his gray hair. "Let's see what's so important." The Mustang led him deep into the forest, following no path that Jack could discern, yet moving with unwavering confidence. Jack struggled to keep up, his bad knee sending sharp pains up his leg with each uneven step. The forest grew thicker, the terrain more challenging, and several times Jack considered turning back. "I'm too old for this wild goose chase," he grumbled, pausing to catch his breath. The Mustang stopped immediately, turning to face him. There was something in those eyes, patience perhaps, or understanding, that silenced Jack's complaints. The horse walked back to him and stood still, waiting until Jack was ready to continue. "You're a strange one," Jack said, reaching out cautiously. To his surprise, the Mustang allowed him to touch its neck, the muscle warm and solid beneath his palm. For nearly an hour, they continued this way, venturing deeper into parts of the forest Jack had never explored despite his years living on its edge. The trees began to thin, and suddenly they emerged into a small clearing. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin, similar to his own but clearly abandoned for some time. Thick vines crawled up its walls, and moss covered portions of the roof, but the structure itself appeared surprisingly intact. What truly struck Jack, however, was the overwhelming sense of familiarity. He'd never been here before. He was certain of it, yet something about the place tugged at his memory. The Mustang nickered softly and stepped forward, leading Jack toward the cabin. At the bottom of the 3 wooden steps leading to the porch, the horse stopped and turned its gaze toward the door. Jack hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his waist. "Is someone in there?" he asked, not really expecting an answer from the horse, yet somehow not feeling foolish for asking. The Mustang merely stared at the door, then back at Jack. Again, the message was clear: go inside. With a deep breath, Jack climbed the steps, each one creaking under his weight. He paused at the weathered door, his hand hovering over the rusted knob. An inexplicable feeling washed over him, a certainty that whatever waited on the other side would change everything. The door swung open with a long, protesting groan, and Jack stepped into the shadows, unaware that the most extraordinary discovery of his life awaited him. The magnificent Mustang deliberately didn't enter the cabin. Instead, the powerful horse hesitated at the threshold, extending one hoof carefully to paw once at the weather-worn wooden planks, as if testing their solidity or perhaps marking a symbolic boundary between two worlds. The animal then released a resonant snort that seemed to convey a curious mixture of caution and disapproval before backing away with remarkable grace, its muscular body moving with fluid precision. The Mustang took up a vigilant position near the bottom of the sagging porch steps, assuming what Jack immediately recognized as a protective stance that spoke of military discipline rather than wild animal behavior. His delicately shaped ears remained in constant motion, swiveling independently like sophisticated radar dishes calibrated to detect the faintest sounds emanating from the dense surrounding forest. Those ears twitched at each subtle noise, the distant chattering of squirrels engaged in their autumn gathering, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional melodic trilling of unseen birds announcing territorial boundaries. Jack observed this behavior with growing fascination, drawing on decades-old training that had taught him to read the environment through others' reactions. A vigilant animal often provided better warning of approaching danger than any human sentry. Without exchanging a single word, Jack understood implicitly. The extraordinary horse was deliberately standing guard, protecting him while he explored the mysterious cabin's interior. "You've done this before, haven't you, boy?" Jack murmured, his voice barely audible even to himself. The Mustang's ear flicked backward at the sound, but his attention remained focused outward, scanning the forest's edge with methodical precision. Drawing a deep breath that carried the mingled scents of pine sap, autumn leaves, and approaching winter, Jack turned back to face the cabin's shadowy interior. The doorway framed a tableau of abandonment and forgotten memories, a life interrupted and left suspended in time like an insect preserved in amber. He stepped across the threshold, the old floorboards groaning beneath his weight as if giving voice to years of silence. The mysterious interior of the long-abandoned cabin was dimly illuminated with a cathedral-like quality that reminded Jack of the small country church his mother had insisted they attend every Sunday during his childhood in rural Montana. Countless dust motes danced hypnotically in the few angled shafts of golden sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy, cobweb-draped windows, creating ethereal columns of illumination that seemed almost holy in their quiet beauty. The dancing particles resembled miniature galaxies swirling in the half-light, disturbed by his entrance after what must have been years of uninterrupted stillness. Jack purposefully blinked several times in rapid succession, allowing his aging eyes to gradually adjust to the disorienting half-light that pervaded the space. The transition from bright mountain sunlight to the cabin's muted interior temporarily transformed the world into indistinct shapes and shadows. As his vision adapted, details emerged from the gloom like photographs developing in chemical baths. First outlines, then textures, and finally the subtle colors muted by years of dust and abandonment. A distinctive, evocative scent unexpectedly hung in the still air, complex and multi-layered. The predominant notes were exactly what he might have expected: musty abandonment, the slightly sweet decay of old wood, the mineral smell of cold stone, perhaps a hint of rodent occupation. But curiously, beneath those expected odors lurked something else entirely, something that persistently tugged at the deepest recesses of his memory like a half-forgotten melody from childhood, or the name of an old friend that hovers just beyond the reach of recollection. When recognition finally came, it hit with such unexpected force that Jack physically staggered backward. The unmistakable, faint trace of Old Spice aftershave, the exact same distinctive brand that Mike Hansen had religiously used throughout their tour of duty in Vietnam. That particular fragrance, with its distinctive blend of citrus, cloves, and vanilla, had been Mike's one unwavering concession to civilization in the brutal chaos of war. While other soldiers abandoned such niceties within weeks of arriving in country, Mike had stubbornly maintained this small ritual, refusing to let the jungle strip away this final vestige of his pre-war identity. "Just my overactive imagination playing cruel tricks," Jack muttered dismissively to himself, unconsciously running a weathered hand over his unshaven face. But despite his verbal denial, his treacherous heart began to beat noticeably faster in his chest, the rhythm accelerating like distant war drums approaching through jungle mist. The vivid, uninvited flashbacks materialized without any warning, as they invariably did despite years of therapy and prescribed medication. For one disorienting moment, he wasn't standing in an abandoned cabin deep in the Montana wilderness at all. He was instantaneously transported back to a makeshift plywood barracks in war-torn Vietnam, the oppressively humid air thick with acrid cigarette smoke, the unmistakable pungent smell of unwashed bodies, equipment cleaned with solvent, and that pervasive jungle rot that seemed to affect everything from boot leather to human spirits. In this powerful memory, Mike Hansen sat casually on the edge of his military-issue canvas cot, methodically applying Old Spice with an exaggerated theatrical formality that inevitably made the other battle-weary men erupt with much-needed laughter in the midst of their living nightmare. Just because we're stuck indefinitely in this godforsaken hellhole doesn't mean we can't maintain certain civilized standards as gentlemen, Mike had solemnly declared with mock seriousness, his face arranged in an exaggerated expression of dignity that contrasted comically with his filthy uniform and the mud caked in his hair. He had then generously offered the cherished glass bottle to Jack with an elaborate flourish worthy of a maitre d' at a five-star restaurant. Class and dignity, Miller. That's what fundamentally separates us from the animals and the enemy. The men had howled with laughter, a rare moment of levity in the grinding horror of their daily existence. Jack had played along, accepting the bottle with equally exaggerated gratitude, dabbing a tiny amount behind his ears before passing it to the next man. That small ritual had somehow made the unbearable slightly more bearable, transforming their squalid barracks into something approaching human for just a few precious minutes. The vivid memory reluctantly faded as quickly as it had unexpectedly appeared, leaving Jack momentarily disoriented and instinctively gripping his supportive cane significantly more tightly to remain upright as the room seemed to spin lazily around him. He closed his eyes briefly, waiting for the vertigo to pass, focusing on his breathing as the VA psychiatrist had taught him decades ago. In, hold out. Count to 4 with each phase. Ground yourself in the present. These unpredictable episodes had gradually become somewhat less frequent over the intervening decades, but they'd never completely stopped tormenting him as the various doctors had repeatedly promised they would with proper medication and therapy. The diverse array of VA psychiatrists collectively called it complex post-traumatic stress disorder, methodically prescribing countless pills that effectively dulled absolutely everything in his emotional spectrum. The undeniably traumatic memories, but also, tragically, the precious good ones that he desperately needed to preserve as anchors to his humanity. He deliberately stopped taking all prescribed medications nearly a decade ago, consciously preferring to face his persistent demons with clear-headed sobriety, even if it meant living with the occasional ambush from his own rebellious mind. Better to feel everything, even the pain, than to feel nothing at all. The nightmares and flashbacks were the price he paid for remaining himself, whatever broken version of himself remained after all he'd experienced. When the spinning sensation finally subsided, Jack took a moment to properly survey his surroundings. The modestly sized cabin consisted of a single large room with rough-hewn logs meticulously forming the sturdy walls, expertly notched together by someone with considerable skill in traditional frontier construction techniques. The craftsmanship spoke of patience and precision, qualities that seemed at odds with a hastily built hunter's shelter or temporary dwelling. This had been built to last by someone who understood that proper construction was the difference between survival and disaster in the unforgiving Montana winters. A substantial river stone fireplace dominated the entire north wall, the carefully fitted stones varying in color from deep charcoal to rust red and sandy tan. The hearth extended outward with a small bench on either side, perfect for drying boots or warming cold hands after hours outside. Cold gray ashes in its blackened grate suggested it hadn't been used in many months, possibly years. But the arrangement of half-burned logs indicated the last fire had been carefully banked rather than allowed to burn out naturally, the action of someone who expected to return. Above the mantel hung a carved wooden plaque bearing the airborne insignia, wings surrounding a parachute, identical to the one Jack had received upon completing jump school before deploying to Vietnam. The wood was darkened with age and smoke, the carving amateur but heartfelt, exactly the kind of object a soldier might create during long hours of downtime. A simple wooden table accompanied by 2 mismatched handmade chairs stood precisely in the center of the plank floor, like furniture awaiting dinner guests who had been inexplicably delayed. One chair was robustly built with thick legs and arms, designed for a larger man, while the other was slightly more delicate in construction, though equally functional. The table's surface was scarred with marks of daily use. Knife cuts, burned circles from hot pans, rings from countless coffee cups. The accumulated evidence of years of habitation. A narrow military-style cot was pushed against the far western wall, its olive drab woolen blankets meticulously folded with unmistakable military precision. Hospital corners and exact angles that any drill sergeant would approve. The placement suggested defensive thinking, positioned to allow its occupant a clear view of both the door and windows while offering the most protected corner of the cabin. It was exactly where Jack would have placed his own bed, a realization that sent an uncomfortable shiver along his spine. Carefully constructed shelves systematically lined the opposite eastern wall, filled with a surprising variety of books, dented canned goods of various ages, and assorted survival supplies arranged with methodical organization that indicated a mind that valued order and preparedness. The bottom shelves held practical items, tools, ammunition boxes, first aid supplies, while the upper shelves contained the unexpected luxury of books, their spines presenting a curious mixture of practical manuals and literature. A tarnished brass kerosene lamp sat expectantly on the dusty table, unlit but apparently ready for immediate use. The glass chimney clean despite the surrounding dust, the reservoir likely still containing fuel. Beside it lay a box of wooden matches and what appeared to be a half-finished letter, the pencil placed diagonally across the page, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought and expected to return momentarily. Everything visible was uniformly coated in a substantial layer of accumulated dust and ghostly cobwebs, transforming ordinary objects into mysterious shapes that required careful examination to identify. Yet despite this evidence of abandonment, there was something undeniably deliberate and meaningful about the precise arrangement of the humble possessions. This clearly wasn't simply an abandoned seasonal hunting shack used occasionally by passing sportsmen. Someone had purposefully lived here, intentionally made it a functional home over an extended period. And then, what exactly had transpired? Had they simply left voluntarily, or had death claimed them in this isolated outpost? Jack moved slowly and methodically through the confined space, his carved wooden cane rhythmically thumping against the uneven wooden floor with each labored step, creating a hollow percussive soundtrack to his exploration. Each deliberate movement unavoidably stirred up additional dust, creating small clouds that caught the sunbeams and triggered a minor coughing fit that racked his aging body. The spasm bent him double for a moment, his hand instinctively moving to brace against the table for support. Outside, he distinctly heard the Mustang's concerned, responsive nicker floating through the open door, the sound questioning and alert, as if the intuitive animal were genuinely checking to confirm he was physically all right despite the temporary respiratory distress. The horse's concern struck Jack as uncannily human. "I'm perfectly fine, boy," Jack reflexively called back reassuringly once he could speak again, his own gravelly voice sounding peculiarly strange and foreign in the oppressive stillness of the long-abandoned cabin. The words seemed to hang in the air, absorbed by the dusty surfaces without echo, as if the cabin itself were hungry for human speech after so long without it. He thoughtfully ran his weathered fingers along the cracked leather spines of the assembled books occupying the sagging shelves, leaving visible tracks in the accumulated gray dust that coated everything. The titles revealed eclectic interests, military history texts featuring extensively dog-eared pages on Vietnam campaigns, illustrated field medicine manuals with handwritten notes in the margins, detailed wildlife identification guides focused particularly on North American fauna, topographical maps of the surrounding wilderness meticulously annotated with handwritten notes, and, most surprisingly, an extensive collection of classic American poetry that seemed oddly out of place among the survival-focused material. Whitman, Frost, Dickinson, Oliver, and numerous others stood at attention like literary soldiers on the rough-hewn shelves. These were certainly not the reading materials he would typically expect to discover in a remote mountain hermit's rustic collection. The poetry volumes showed the most wear, their spines cracked and pages rippled from frequent handling, suggesting they provided more comfort to the cabin's former occupant than the practical survival guides. One specific volume immediately caught his practiced eye, a well-worn burgundy leather-bound edition of Leaves of Grass, the exact same distinctive publication he devotedly carried throughout his harrowing tour in Vietnam. The coincidence was too specific to dismiss. That particular edition had been published by Oxford University Press in a limited run just before his deployment, and he'd purchased it on impulse from a bookstore in San Francisco during their last weekend of freedom before shipping out. During those interminable nights on guard duty, he had frequently read selected passages aloud to Mike, the whispered words of Whitman helping to keep them both alert and relatively sane amid the surrounding insanity of war. Mike had initially mocked his literary pretensions, but gradually developed a genuine appreciation for the poetry, often requesting specific poems that spoke to their situation. Vigil Strange, I Kept on the Field One Night, had become a particular favorite after they'd lost their first squad member to a sniper. Jack carefully pulled the volume from the shelf, half expecting it to disintegrate in his hands, but it remained intact despite its age. He opened it reverently, and a dried leaf, perhaps used as a bookmark, fluttered to the floor. The page it had marked contained When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, a poem about finding truth in direct experience rather than secondhand explanations. Several lines had been underlined in faded pencil. Till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself, in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time, looked up in perfect silence at the stars. A memory surfaced unbidden, Mike pointing out constellations during a rare quiet moment, the Vietnamese sky brilliantly clear during the dry season, the stars seeming close enough to touch. That's what we're fighting for, Jack, he had said softly. The right to look at stars without wondering if they're guiding bombers or artillery. Jack carefully returned the book to its place, his hand lingering momentarily on its spine. The coincidence was too precise, too personal. It felt deliberately chosen, like a message left specifically for him to find. But that was impossible unless his wandering attention was suddenly drawn to the centrally positioned table. Among the undisturbed dust lay a conspicuous cream-colored envelope, noticeably yellowed with the inevitable passage of time, but still distinct against the darker wood. Unlike absolutely everything else visible within the cabin, this specific envelope showed unmistakable signs of having been deliberately placed there extremely recently. The accumulated dust surrounding it had been visibly disturbed, creating a clean, distinctive rectangle on the table's otherwise uniformly coated surface that stood out like a freshly dug grave in an abandoned cemetery. The contrast was jarring, a disruption in the perfect stillness that had otherwise remained undisturbed for what must have been years. Someone had been here recently. Someone had placed that envelope deliberately, creating a stage-managed scene for him to discover. The realization sent a chill down Jack's spine despite the cabin's afternoon warmth. Jack cautiously approached the table, an inexplicable growing sense of imminent dread building relentlessly in his constricted chest with each deliberate step forward. His right hand instinctively moved toward the pistol at his waist, a combat veteran's reflex when confronting the unknown, before he consciously relaxed his posture. There was no threat here, at least not a physical one. The mysterious envelope conspicuously bore no written name, address, or identifying marks of any kind. It simply lay there in silent invitation or challenge, its presence an anomaly that demanded investigation. With fingers that had suddenly begun to tremble uncontrollably like autumn leaves in a gathering storm, he carefully picked it up, noting its substantial weight and the quality of the paper. Not cheap stationery, but something more formal, the kind used for official correspondence or significant communications. It was deliberately left unsealed, the flap merely tucked into the body of the envelope as if encouraging examination. He meticulously extracted a single sheet of heavyweight cotton paper, the type that contained rag content and was designed to last for decades without deterioration. He unfolded it with mounting anticipation mixed with inexplicable fear, his heart racing with an intensity he hadn't experienced since combat. The distinctive handwriting displayed on the page hit him with the devastating physical force of a mortar round, momentarily stealing the very breath from his lungs and causing his knees to buckle slightly. He instantly recognized those precise, slightly rightward slanted letters that had always reminded him of the careful penmanship taught by strict Catholic school nuns in the previous generation, a distinctive hand unlike any other he had ever encountered. The careful formation of each character, the way the loops on the lowercase g and y extended with a slight flourish, the precise dotting of each I directly above the stem rather than drifting right as was common with most writers. He had seen those exact distinctive characters countless times before in eagerly anticipated letters dutifully sent from the humid, dangerous jungle to his parents' modest clapboard home in rural Montana. He had received them like lifelines during his hospital recovery after being wounded, reading each one countless times until the paper grew thin at the folds. Those same distinctive characters had appeared in hastily scribbled notes, surreptitiously passed during endless monotonous hours of mind-numbing guard duty, usually containing terrible jokes or obscene limericks designed to break the tension and fight the overwhelming fatigue that made each minute feel like an hour. And most hauntingly, he had seen that handwriting in a heartbreaking, blood-stained final message desperately meant for a patiently waiting girlfriend back home in Minneapolis that Jack had solemnly promised to personally deliver if the very worst happened on the battlefield. He had delivered that final letter to Catherine Sullivan 6 months after returning home, his dress uniform uncomfortable, and his rehearsed words of condolence sticking in his throat as the young woman with sad eyes and a gentle smile invited him in for coffee. They had talked for hours about Mike, sharing stories until they were both laughing through tears. She had married someone else 2 years later, but had written to Jack occasionally over the decades, holiday cards and brief updates that had gradually tapered off as life pulled them in different directions. He wondered if she was still alive, if somewhere she still kept that blood-stained letter as a memorial to her first love. Mike. The painfully familiar name involuntarily escaped his dry lips as little more than a disbelieving whisper, simultaneously a desperate prayer and an unanswerable question that hung heavily in the dusty, oppressive air of the silent cabin, like a physical presence. Another vivid, uninvited flashback suddenly engulfed him without warning. Mike confidently grinning that trademark lopsided smile as he casually pulled off his sweat-stained helmet after a successful mission, dark, unruly hair characteristically plastered to his tan forehead with perspiration from the unrelenting jungle heat and suffocating humidity. The memory was so vivid that Jack could almost smell the distinctive mixture of sweat, insect repellent, and gun oil that had been their constant companions. "You thinking excessively hard again, Miller? I can practically smell the mental smoke from over here," Mike had quipped, tossing him a warm can of Coca-Cola that had cost him 3 packs of cigarettes in trade. Save the deep thoughts for college professors and politicians. Out here, thinking too much will get you killed. Always reliably joking, perpetually ready with a perfectly timed quip to effectively break the suffocating tension, even as the soul-destroying war methodically ground them down day by relentless day like grain between millstones. Mike had been their platoon's heart, the one who somehow managed to find humor in the darkest situations, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who wrote letters for the guys who were barely literate, who carried extra socks to share when the monsoons left everyone perpetually wet and at risk of trench foot. Mike Hansen had been substantially more than merely his assigned best friend during their shared Vietnam nightmare. They had genuinely become brothers in absolutely everything but actual blood relation, their bond forged in the excruciating heat of combat and the aching loneliness of being strangers in a strange land where death lurked behind every tree and in every friendly smile from a village child. They were permanently bonded through the transformative crucible of war in a profound way that fortunate civilians could never possibly understand or appreciate. They had repeatedly saved each other's lives more times than either could accurately count, each instance creating another unbreakable strand in the rope that tied them together. Jack recalled with perfect clarity the day Mike had pulled him into a drainage ditch seconds before machine gun fire had torn through the space where he'd been standing. He remembered dragging Mike from a burning personnel carrier, both of them coughing and half blind from the smoke. He could still feel the pressure of Mike's hands applying a tourniquet to his leg after a booby trap had caught him with its spray of rusty nails and scrap metal. They had shared pitiful sea rations and precious black market cigarettes when supplies ran dangerously low, dividing everything with the careful equity of brothers who measured fairness in precise halves. They had whispered their deepest personal fears and closely guarded aspirations in the oppressive darknesses of countless jungle nights, while constantly listening for the inevitable approach of determined enemy patrols seeking American targets. Jack had known things about Mike that no one else did, that he was terrified of spiders despite fearlessly facing enemy fire, that he secretly wrote poetry on scraps of paper that he always burned afterward, that he planned to become a doctor after the war, that he sometimes wept silently in his sleep. Mike, in turn, had been the only one Jack had confided in about his recurring nightmare of being buried alive in the jungle mud, about his growing fear that he was becoming someone his family wouldn't recognize, about the engagement ring hidden in his footlocker for the girl who eventually married someone else during his second tour. They had created a bond that was supposed to last a lifetime. Until that catastrophic final patrol outside the besieged hills surrounding Quezon that had changed everything forever. The traumatic memories came flooding back with merciless clarity. The sudden, distinctive crack of enemy AK-47 automatic fire erupting from concealed positions in the dense undergrowth that had appeared empty moments before. The heart-wrenching screams of grievously wounded young men calling desperately for their mothers, a sound so primordial it transcended language and culture. The unforgiving earth beneath him violently erupting in a shower of dirt and fragmentation as a precision-aimed mortar round landed dangerously close to their hastily established position. Their point man had gone down first, his body folding in on itself before he could even raise his weapon. The radio operator went next, half his face suddenly gone in a spray of crimson that painted the broad leaves beside the trail. They had attempted to establish a defensive perimeter, but the enemy fire came from too many directions at once, well-coordinated and devastatingly accurate. Jack had taken multiple white-hot shrapnel fragments directly in his unprotected right knee as he dove for cover, the pain so immediate and overwhelming that he had vomited even as he continued firing his M16 toward the muzzle flashes visible through the smoke and chaos. He remembered Mike screaming his name, remembered trying to crawl toward the sound, remembered the second mortar round landing even closer, the concussion picking him up and slamming him against a tree trunk. Then nothing but fragmented images, the whop, whop, whop of medevac helicopters, a medic's face swimming in and out of focus, the metallic taste of morphine in his mouth, someone cutting away his boot and pants leg, the sterile white ceiling of a field hospital, a doctor's grave expression when he asked about the rest of his squad. When he eventually regained partial consciousness in a chaotic field hospital 3 days later, groggy from extensive surgery and powerful medications, the solemn-faced doctors regretfully informed him that Mike hadn't survived the coordinated ambush. His broken body had never been successfully recovered from the active battlefield, becoming just one more unfortunate American boy eternally swallowed by the voracious, unforgiving Vietnamese jungle that claimed so many young lives during those terrible years of senseless conflict. The devastating personal loss had nearly completely destroyed Jack's remaining fragile sanity. Mike had consistently been his dependable anchor, the steadfast one who reliably reminded him of their shared humanity when the dehumanizing horrors of war repeatedly threatened to systematically strip it away completely, leaving nothing but empty, soulless killing machines in place of the idealistic young men who had initially arrived in country with their heads full of patriotic speeches and hearts full of misplaced courage. Without Mike's stabilizing presence, Jack had mechanically completed his remaining tour of duty in a perpetual haze of soul-crushing grief and explosive, unpredictable anger, recklessly taking extreme tactical risks that made even the most hardened combat veterans actively avoid serving alongside him on dangerous patrols. The other men had given him a wide berth, recognizing the particular madness of a soldier who no longer cared whether he lived or died, perhaps even preferred the latter. He'd eventually returned stateside with multiple unwanted medals and commendations he didn't remotely deserve, accompanied by a profound, unfillable, emotional hollowness that no well-meaning civilian counselor or concerned family member could possibly comprehend or successfully address with platitudes and group therapy sessions. The physical wounds had healed, leaving him with a permanent limp and an honorable discharge, but the psychological damage had never fully healed, despite decades of attempting to build some semblance of a normal life. Jack unsteadily lowered himself into one of the handcrafted wooden chairs, his suddenly weakened legs no longer capable of reliably supporting his trembling body. The solid chair creaked beneath his weight, the sound startlingly loud in the cabin stillness. Through the partially open cabin door, he clearly observed the vigilant Mustang continuing to watch him with unwavering intensity, the horse's penetrating gaze eerily knowing and somehow reassuring despite the overwhelming circumstances. Jack deliberately forced his wandering attention back to the mysterious letter clutched in his shaking hands and hesitantly began to read the carefully written words. Jack, if you're presently reading these words after all this time, then that remarkably stubborn Mustang has finally successfully led you here, as I always hoped and believed he eventually would. His given name is Spirit, by the way, which seems extraordinarily fitting for his unusual nature and special purpose, doesn't it? I genuinely don't know how to adequately explain the complex circumstances that have led to this moment. I'm not entirely sure I completely understand everything myself, even after all these intervening years of reflection and analysis. But regardless, I absolutely owe you the unvarnished truth after so much lost time between us. I didn't actually die that terrible day in the jungle as you were falsely informed. After the carefully planned ambush, when we became separated in the chaos and confusion of combat, I was unfortunately captured by North Vietnamese regular forces operating in the area. I subsequently spent 3 extremely difficult years in a secret prisoner of war camp before I finally managed to orchestrate an escape during a chaotic prisoner transfer. By then, the increasingly unpopular war was very nearly over, and I was fundamentally changed in profound ways. The man who naively went into that brutal camp wasn't remotely the same broken individual who eventually emerged from captivity. When I finally made it back to American soil after extensive debriefing and medical treatment, I immediately began searching for you with the limit, moving with a sudden urgent purpose that belied his years and physical limitations. Jack pushed himself laboriously up from the rough-hewn wooden chair. The ancient floorboards beneath him protested with a symphony of creaks and groans that seemed to give voice to his own aching joints. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, steadying himself against the overwhelming cascade of emotions that threatened to buckle his knees. The letter, Mike's letter, remained clutched in his left hand, the paper already beginning to show wear along its creases from his tight grip. The revelation contained within those carefully penned words had shattered the foundations of a grief he'd carried for half a century. A grief that had shaped him, defined him, become so fundamentally entwined with his identity that he scarcely knew who he was without it. If Mike had survived that hellish day in the jungle, then who exactly had Jack been mourning all these years? What did it mean for the bitter, reclusive man he'd become, a man forged in the white-hot crucible of that specific loss? These questions swirled in his mind like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind, but they would have to wait. First, he needed to see what else Mike had left behind. The metal box mentioned in the letter promised more answers, or perhaps more questions, but either way, it represented a tangible connection to the friend he'd believed lost forever in the humid nightmare of Southeast Asia. With deliberate care, Jack knelt beside the narrow military-style bed positioned against the far wall, ignoring the sharp, familiar protest from his damaged right knee. The joint had never properly healed despite 3 separate surgeries at VA hospitals across 2 decades. The Army doctors had wanted to amputate initially, but he'd stubbornly refused, preferring a lifetime of pain to the alternative. Now, as the damaged cartilage ground against bone, with even this careful movement, he momentarily questioned the wisdom of that youthful decision. The pain triggered another flashback. These had become more frequent since he'd entered the cabin, as if proximity to these physical reminders of Mike had weakened the mental barriers he'd constructed over decades. Suddenly, he was no longer in a dusty Montana cabin, but lying on a stretcher in a field hospital near Khe Sanh, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the chemical sharpness of antiseptic. The morphine dulled the edges of his agony, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. A surgeon with exhausted eyes and blood-spattered scrubs, was explaining something about nerve damage and embedded metal fragments. But Jack wasn't really listening. He was asking about Mike, asking again and again until a nurse finally told him to save his strength, that his friend hadn't made it. The memory dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Jack momentarily disoriented as past and present collided. He took a deep, steadying breath, anchoring himself in the sensory reality of the cabin, the musty scent of undisturbed dust, the golden quality of afternoon sunlight streaming through grimy windows, the distant call of a hawk outside. This was real. And somewhere beneath this narrow bed lay evidence that everything he'd believed about Mike's fate had been wrong. Jack lowered himself fully to his knees with a grunt of discomfort, supporting his weight on one hand while extending the other beneath the bed frame. His fingers probed the darkness blindly, encountering nothing at first but dust in what felt like a small animal's abandoned nest. Then his knuckles struck something solid with a dull metallic thunk. He adjusted his position, stretching farther until his fingertips found the distinctive shape of a rectangular container. With methodical effort, he dragged the object toward him, recognizing its contours even before it emerged into the light. A standard-issue ammunition box, the kind they'd commonly used in Vietnam for storing everything from actual ammunition to letters from home, contraband cigarettes, and the precious few personal items soldiers allowed themselves in the field. This particular box was olive drab with faded yellow stenciling on its side, a familiar sight that instantly transported Jack back to his tour of duty. Each platoon member had personalized their ammo box in some way. Jack had carved his initials into the lid with his combat knife. Rodriguez had painted a miniature Puerto Rican flag on his. Williams had covered his with rock band logos. Mike had always kept his pristine except for a small cross etched into one corner, not from religious conviction, but as a private joke. He'd claimed it was to ensure the Almighty knew which box to protect during mortar attacks. This box showed no such personalization, but Jack knew instinctively that it had been Mike's. Perhaps not his original box from Vietnam, but one acquired later and repurposed as a container for the possessions and memories he'd most wanted to preserve. Now it had been repurposed again. As a time capsule, a message in a bottle cast into the ocean of years that separated them, now finally washing ashore at Jack's feet. Dust coated the box's flat top, forming a uniform gray layer that softened its military angularity. Jack noticed immediately that unlike the rest of the cabin's contents, the box's latches were surprisingly free of corrosion, suggesting it had been opened relatively recently, certainly more recently than Mike's death, according to the grave marker Spirit had shown him. Someone had been maintaining this box, perhaps adding to its contents in the intervening years. The brass latches caught the sunlight as Jack carefully flipped them open, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the cabin's stillness. He hesitated before lifting the lid, suddenly struck by the significance of what he was about to do. This wasn't simply opening a container. It was opening a portal to a past he'd never known existed, a parallel narrative to the one he'd constructed and believed for 50 years. Whatever lay inside would irrevocably change his understanding of not just Mike's life, but his own as well. With trembling hands that betrayed both age and emotion, Jack finally lifted the lid. The hinges moved smoothly, another indication of recent care and maintenance. A faint scent escaped, old paper, preserved leather, the ghost of tobacco, and with it, the unmistakable essence of memory itself. Inside the meticulously organized box lay several distinct categories of items, each apparently carefully curated, a neatly stacked collection of photographs protected in clear plastic sleeves, a complete set of military dog tags on their standard-issue chain, a small leather-bound journal with a worn spine indicating frequent use, several precisely folded official-looking papers secured with faded rubber bands, and at the bottom, partially obscured by the other items, what appeared to be maps and newspaper clippings. Jack's eyes were immediately drawn to the dog tags resting atop the photographs. Even without touching them, he could see the embossed information. Hanson, Michael J. 536-982457. Oppose Lutheran. The same information that had been on the tags Mike wore in Vietnam. Jack still remembered Mike's habitual gesture of touching the tags through his t-shirt before each patrol, a superstitious ritual that had seemed to Jack both foolish and necessary in the chaos of war where any sense of control, however illusory, was precious. With reverent care, Jack lifted the chain, the metal cool against his skin despite the cabin's warmth. The tags made their distinctive soft clicking sound as they settled against each other, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their war experience, the constant gentle percussion of metal discs against sweaty chests as they humped through the jungle or huddled in foxholes during incoming fire. Jack slipped the chain over his head without conscious thought, allowing Mike's tags to rest against his chest alongside his own that he'd never stopped wearing despite the passing decades. The weight felt right somehow, as if completing a circuit that had remained open far too long. He touched the double set of tags through his shirt, unconsciously mimicking Mike's old gesture, before turning his attention to the photographs. He gingerly lifted out the topmost protected image, handling it as carefully as if it were a priceless artifact, which in a way, it was. His breath caught audibly in his throat as he found himself staring at a moment frozen in time, preserved behind clear plastic like an insect in amber. Two impossibly young men in jungle-pattern fatigues stood with arms draped casually around each other's shoulders, their dirt-streaked faces partially obscured beneath hastily applied camouflage paint, but still visibly grinning widely at the unseen photographer. Their youth was shocking to Jack. Had they ever really been that young? Their lean frames had not yet acquired the perpetual tension that later characterized every soldier who'd spent enough time in country. Their eyes still held a trace of the innocence that Vietnam would systematically strip away, replacing it with a haunted vigilance that most would carry for the remainder of their lives. Jack remembered precisely when that particular photograph had been taken, exactly 48 hours before the devastating ambush that had apparently separated them for decades. Their specialized reconnaissance platoon had just successfully completed a challenging intelligence-gathering mission deep in contested territory without suffering any casualties. They'd returned to base camp tired but exhilarated by their success and their survival, that peculiar euphoria known only to those who faced death and temporarily outmaneuvered it. For one brief, ephemeral moment of youthful invincibility, they'd collectively felt genuinely untouchable. As young men thrust prematurely into combat zones, sometimes foolishly convince themselves they are, before reality comes crashing down upon their naive delusions of immortality. Lieutenant Cooper had snapped the photo with a camera he'd carried throughout his tour, promising to send them copies after developing the film back in the world, their universal term for America, that increasingly mythic place that existed in their memories and hopefully in their futures. Cooper had kept his promise, sending the developed photographs months later. By then, Jack had been recovering in a stateside hospital, and the smiling faces in the images had seemed to belong to strangers, boys he'd once known who no longer existed, replaced by men with older eyes or, in too many cases, by white crosses and folded flags. He'd stored the photos in a shoebox that eventually went into his attic, unable to look at them but equally unable to discard them. The wave of nostalgia that washed over Jack as he studied the photo was almost physically painful in its intensity. He could almost smell the distinctive blend of jungle rot, insect repellent, gun oil, and unwashed bodies that had been their constant companion. Could almost feel the oppressive humidity that made everything perpetually damp. The weight of equipment digging into shoulders, the hyper-vigilant tension that never fully dissipated even in supposedly secure areas. He remembered the endless, mindless card games they'd played to pass the time between patrols, the elaborate, impossible plans they'd made for what they'd do after their tours ended, the nicknames they'd given each other that had sometimes supplanted their real identities. Mike had been Doc because he'd been pre-med before being drafted, while Jack had earned Professor for his habit of quoting literature during lulls in the fighting, a peculiar affectation that had initially drawn mockery but eventually became a requested distraction during the darkest hours. With reluctant care, Jack set the first photograph aside and turned to the next in the stack. This second image made his hands shake so violently with shock that he nearly dropped it back into the protective container. Unlike the first photo with its clear provenance in his memory, this one depicted something that simply couldn't exist according to everything Jack believed about his life. The photo clearly showed him and Mike, both obviously much older than in the Vietnam image, standing side by side on the porch of Jack's own cabin. The familiar split log construction and red-painted door were unmistakable. This was definitely the place he'd built with his own hands 20 years ago as a sanctuary from a world he no longer felt part of. Jack's hair was steel gray in the image, his face lined with the same deep creases that greeted him in the mirror each morning. Mike appeared gaunt, but still vital, his arm casually draped around Jack's shoulders in a gesture that spoke of comfortable familiarity. Both men were smiling, not the forced grins of posed photographs, but the genuine expression of shared amusement, as if they'd just exchanged a private joke known only to them. In one corner of the image, the distinctive chestnut form of Spirit was visible, grazing peacefully in the background as if he'd always been part of the scene. Jack had absolutely no memory of this photo, no recollection whatsoever of Mike visiting his cabin, no recognition of the moment captured so clearly in the image he held. Yet here was incontrovertible evidence, solid in his trembling hands, of a moment that couldn't possibly have happened according to the narrative of his life as he understood it. It was like discovering a chapter torn from someone else's autobiography, mysteriously inserted into his own. The characters were correct, the setting familiar, but the events depicted were completely foreign to his experience. As he stared at the photographic impossibility, Jack's mind frantically sought rational explanations. Could it be a clever forgery created through photographic manipulation? But for what purpose and by whom? The level of detail was too perfect. From the particular way Jack tilted his head when genuinely smiling to the specific pattern of faded patches on the flannel shirt he still owned and wore regularly. Besides, who would go to such elaborate lengths to create such a deception, complete with the cabin and all its carefully arranged contents? Could it be that the man in the photo wasn't actually Mike, but someone who closely resembled him? But the distinctive scar that bisected Mike's right eyebrow, a souvenir from a bar fight during basic training, was clearly visible in the image. No, the simplest explanation, however impossible it seemed, was that the photo was genuine. That somehow, against all logic and memory, Mike and Jack had indeed stood together on that porch. Two old soldiers sharing a moment of camaraderie that had subsequently vanished from Jack's consciousness like morning mist under a rising sun. Confusion and profound disbelief warred in Jack's mind as he shuffled through additional photographs that told a similar impossible story. Jack and Mike fishing together at the stream that ran behind the cabin, sitting beside a campfire passing a bottle between them, working together to repair the cabin's roof after winter storm damage. Each image depicted events Jack had no memory of experiencing, yet each contained details so specific and accurate that they couldn't possibly be fabrications. In one particularly disturbing photo, Jack lay in a hospital bed, his head bandaged and his eyes closed. Mike sat beside him, clearly keeping vigil, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. Jack had no memory of any hospitalization after his initial recovery from Vietnam. Yet there he was, unmistakably himself in a medical setting, with Mike watching over him. The date stamp in the corner indicated this had occurred in 1993, nearly 2 decades after Mike's supposed death. Feeling increasingly unmoored from his own reality, Jack carefully set the photographs aside and picked up the leather-bound journal. The worn cover felt smooth beneath his fingertips, softened by years of handling. A simple brass clasp held it closed, not locked, but effectively keeping the pages protected. Jack released the clasp with care and opened the journal, immediately recognizing the same distinctive handwriting from the letter. The pages were filled with Mike's careful script, entries dating back decades and continuing up until what must have been shortly before his death. Jack flipped through the journal randomly at first, glimpsing fragments of a life he'd had no idea existed. Mike's struggles with his own PTSD, his decision to build the cabin, his efforts to reconnect with his old friend. The entries varied in length and tone, some merely recording daily activities, while others delved into profound philosophical reflections on suffering, memory, and healing. As Jack continued to browse, a specific entry caught his eye, the date jumping out at him. April 12, 1985, more than 15 years after Vietnam. He focused on the neatly written words, a growing sense of unreality washing over him as he read, "Visited Jack again today. He still doesn't remember our meetings. The doctors say it's his mind protecting itself, burying the trauma deeper each time. It breaks my heart to be a ghost in his life, present but never remembered. Each time I leave, I take away all evidence I was there. It seems kinder than letting him find proof of visits he can't recall. But I keep these photographs to remind myself that I tried, that I didn't completely abandon my brother. Spirit seems to understand what's happening better than I do. He always knows when Jack is having a bad day, always finds a way to comfort him without frightening him. Sometimes I think that horse understands more about healing than all the psychiatrists I've seen. Tomorrow I'll try again. Maybe this time something will stick. Maybe this time when I return, he'll know me." Jack sat heavily on the dusty floor, the journal open in his lap, his mind reeling with implications that threatened to upend everything he believed about his life. The solid wood planks beneath him provided insufficient anchor as his world tilted on its axis, reality reconfiguring itself around this new information. Dissociative amnesia. He had heard the clinical term before during his mandatory sessions with VA psychiatrists after his medical discharge. They'd explained it as the mind's defense mechanism, selectively erasing traumatic memories too painful to integrate into conscious awareness. But could such a condition extend to erasing not just traumatic events, but positive ones as well? Could his mind have been so broken by the belief in Mike's death that it refused to accept evidence to the contrary, systematically erasing each interaction as if protecting a wound from further disturbance? The rational part of Jack's mind resisted this explanation. It seemed too convenient, too much like the plot of a melodramatic film rather than the messy reality of psychological trauma. Yet the evidence before him was difficult to dismiss. The photographs seemed genuine, the journal entries too specific and personal to be fabricated. And there were gaps in his own memory, periods of time he couldn't fully account for, days or sometimes weeks that blurred together in his recollection. He'd always attributed these blank spaces to the drinking that had once been his primary coping mechanism, or to the various medications he'd been prescribed over the years, or simply to the natural deterioration of memory that came with aging. Now, a different explanation presented itself, one that was simultaneously heartbreaking and strangely comforting. If Mike's journal was accurate, the two friends had reconnected numerous times over the decades, only to have Jack's damaged mind repeatedly erase these precious moments, rejecting them as impossible contradictions to his established understanding of reality. Mike had persisted despite this devastating pattern, returning again and again to try different approaches, never abandoning hope that eventually something would break through the amnesia. Jack flipped backward through the journal, finding entry after entry documenting visits to his cabin. In some, they talked for hours about their shared past and their separate journeys since Vietnam. In others, Jack had initially failed to recognize Mike at all, growing suspicious and even threatening when this apparent stranger claimed to be his long-dead friend. In one particularly detailed entry from 1993, Mike described how they'd spent an entire week together, fishing and hunting, reminiscing about their lives before the war, only for Jack to greet him as a complete stranger when Mike returned from a supply run to town. The pattern described was heartbreakingly consistent. Connection, conversation, sometimes even days of apparent recognition and renewed friendship, followed inevitably by disconnection and forgetting when Mike was absent, even briefly. According to the journal, they had enacted this tragic cycle countless times over the decades, with variations but always the same fundamental outcome. Jack's mind refusing to permanently integrate the reality of Mike's survival. One entry from 2001 particularly struck him. I brought Dr. Levine with me today. Took a risk after all these years of keeping my distance from the psychiatric establishment. He observed our interaction from a distance, watched as Jack initially tensed at my approach, then gradually relaxed as we fell into conversation about neutral topics. 3 hours later, Jack was laughing, calling me by name, reminiscing about Kowalski's terrible poker skills and Lieutenant Cooper's obsession with regulations. Then I stepped away to use the bathroom inside Jack's cabin. When I returned just minutes later, the change was already happening. That familiar confusion in his eyes, the subtle shift in posture from relaxed to defensive. By the time we left, he was calling me sir and asking politely when I'd be moving on, as if I were a stranger who had stopped by to ask directions. Brother? Levine was fascinated in that clinical way that makes me want to punch him, though I know he means well. He explained it as state-dependent memory encoding with dissociative barriers. Essentially, Jack's mind has created separate compartments. In one, I'm dead and have been since 1970. In another, I'm alive and we're friends in the present. These realities cannot coexist in his conscious awareness. So when one threatens to contradict the other, his mind simply erases the threatening information. The doctor suggested a more aggressive therapeutic approach, but warned that forcing Jack to confront such fundamentally contradictory beliefs could trigger a complete psychological breakdown. The risk is too great. I won't be the cause of more suffering for him. Better to be a recurring ghost than to destroy what stability he's managed to create for himself. As Jack continued reading, the journal revealed another aspect of this complex situation: Spirit's unique role in their fractured relationship. According to Mike's detailed observations, the Mustang had somehow become a bridge between them, a constant that Jack's mind allowed him to recognize consistently even while rejecting Mike's presence. It's the strangest thing. One entry from 1996 noted, Jack never forgets Spirit. No matter how thoroughly his mind erases our interactions, he always knows the horse, always greets him by name, always remembers their previous encounters. Spirit has become my proxy in a way, able to provide some comfort and connection when I cannot. I've taken to sending the horse ahead when Jack seems to be having particularly difficult days. Spirit somehow knows exactly what to do, sometimes standing quietly while Jack talks to him for hours, sometimes gently nudging him away from the whiskey bottle, sometimes simply keeping watch while Jack sleeps through his nightmares. The more Jack read, the more a new narrative of his life began to form. Not replacing his previous understanding, but expanding alongside it, creating a more complex picture than he'd ever imagined. In this new version of his history, he hadn't been entirely alone during his years of isolation. Mike had been there, watching over him from a distance when direct contact proved too destabilizing. And Spirit had been their intermediary, a silent guardian moving between their separate worlds. Outside, as if summoned by Jack's thoughts, Spirit whinnied loudly, the sound sharper than before. Jack looked up from the journal to see the Mustang had moved to the cabin window and was looking in at him intently, ears pricked forward in apparent concern or perhaps impatience. When their eyes met across the distance, the horse turned his head deliberately to look toward the back of the clearing, then back to Jack, the gesture unmistakable in its meaning. There's something else you need to see. Jack carefully gathered the photographs and journal, reverently returning them to the metal box for safekeeping. He hesitated over Mike's dog tags, then decided to keep them where they were, hanging alongside his own against his chest. Their weight and occasional soft clicking reminded him that this discovery was real, not some elaborate hallucination born of grief and isolation. He tucked the box securely under his arm, using his other hand to grip his cane as he laboriously made his way back outside into the late afternoon sunlight. The day had advanced considerably while he'd been absorbed in his discoveries, the sun now hanging lower in the western sky and casting longer shadows across the clearing. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the distinctive scent of pine and approaching evening that characterized these mountains in early autumn. Spirit was waiting by the porch steps, pawing impatiently at the ground with one hoof, his entire posture communicating urgency. As soon as Jack emerged from the cabin, the Mustang tossed his head and began walking toward the far edge of the clearing, stopping after several paces to look back when Jack didn't immediately follow. "I'm coming," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion and disuse. "Just give an old man a minute to catch up. Some of us don't have 4 good legs anymore." The horse seemed to consider this, then walked back to stand beside Jack, offering his sturdy presence as support. Jack had never been much of a horseman. His limited experience with cavalry units in Vietnam had left him with more respect than affection for the animals. But Spirit's patient companionship felt natural, as if they'd known each other for years. Which, according to Mike's journal, they actually had, even if Jack retained no conscious memory of those interactions. "You remember me, don't you?" Jack asked quietly, reaching out to touch the Mustang's muscular neck. "Even if I don't remember you, at least not properly." Spirit responded with a soft nicker that seemed almost affirmative, leaning slightly into Jack's touch in a gesture that felt practiced and familiar. For a brief, disorienting moment, Jack experienced a flash of what might have been memory, sitting on his own porch as this same horse approached through morning mist, his own voice saying, "Back again, are you? Your timing's good. I could use the company today." The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Jack uncertain whether it was genuine recollection or simply his mind manufacturing a scene to fit the narrative he'd just discovered. When Jack felt steady enough to continue, Spirit led the way with deliberate patience, adjusting his naturally vigorous pace to accommodate Jack's labored gait. They moved toward a section of the clearing that Jack hadn't noticed during his initial approach, an area where the surrounding forest receded slightly to create a smaller secondary glade. A narrow footpath, barely visible among the undergrowth but clearly maintained by regular use, wound between ancient ponderosa pines whose massive trunks bore silent witness to centuries of human passages. The path wasn't long, perhaps 100 yards, but Jack's damaged knee and the emotional turmoil of the day's discoveries made the journey slow and arduous. Spirit remained close beside him, occasionally stopping to allow Jack to rest against his solid warmth when the pain became too intense. During one such pause, Jack noticed something tied to a nearby tree branch, a small bundle of what appeared to be herbs wrapped with sinew, hanging at approximately eye level. "What's that?" he asked, more to himself than to Spirit. But the horse nudged him gently forward, as if encouraging him to continue rather than investigate the curious object. As they neared the end of the path, the trees began to thin, and shafts of golden late afternoon sunlight slanted through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The path opened suddenly into a small, perfectly circular sunlit glade that seemed almost deliberately designed, too perfectly symmetrical to be entirely natural. Wildflowers dotted the lush grass despite the advancing season, creating splashes of purple, yellow, and white among the dominant green. Birdsong filled the air with a peaceful melody that contrasted sharply with the emotional turbulence Jack felt within. At the precise center of this hidden sanctuary, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree, whose massive trunk must have witnessed centuries of seasons, stood a simple wooden marker. The craftsmanship was evident even from a distance. This was no hastily constructed cross or crude stake, but a carefully carved monument created with skill and obvious affection. As Jack drew closer, he could see that the marker bore no conventional name or dates such as one might find in a traditional cemetery. Instead, carved with precision and deeply inlaid with what appeared to be silver wire to preserve it against the elements, was a pair of stylized wings, the unmistakable circle of their airborne unit in Vietnam. The insignia they had worn with pride, the brotherhood they had joined with youthful bravado before understanding the true cost of those silver wings that had taken them from safety into the heart of the jungle's crucible. The carving was weathered by years of sun and rain, but had been maintained with obvious care. The wood oiled to prevent rot, the surrounding ground kept clear of encroaching weeds and fallen branches. Someone had visited regularly, tending this memorial with dedication. Understanding dawned with a cold certainty that seeped into Jack's bones like winter rain, an irrefutable truth that could no longer be denied or rationalized away. "No," he whispered, the metal box suddenly heavy as lead in his arms. "No, no, no." The evidence assembled itself in his mind with brutal clarity. The letter on the cabin table, written in Mike's distinctive hand yet placed there recently. The journal documenting decades of interaction that Jack couldn't remember. The photographs showing impossibly shared moments. And now this grave with their unit symbol, lovingly maintained yet clearly established years ago, based on the weathering of the wood and the mature wildflowers surrounding it. Mike had been here living just miles from Jack for decades. Had visited him repeatedly, only to be forgotten each time due to some psychological mechanism Jack couldn't control or even fully comprehend. And now Mike was gone, truly gone this time, with only spirit left to bridge the gap between them. A final messenger carrying out his last mission to connect two old soldiers separated not by distance, but by the fragmented reality of traumatized memory. The weight of this revelation, its implications for everything Jack believed about his life and himself, crashed over him like a physical wave. His legs gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees before the grave of his friend, the metal ammunition box tumbling forgotten to the ground as its contents spilled onto the grass. 50 years of complex grief, guilt, and loss broke free from whatever emotional dam had contained them, erupting in wrenching sobs that echoed through the silent forest glade. "I'm sorry," he gasped between heaving breaths, the words insufficient, yet all he had to offer. "God, Mike, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't remember. I couldn't." The grief was multifaceted, each aspect cutting in its own unique way. He mourned for Mike, now truly lost to him, just when he'd discovered he'd been found. He mourned for the decades of friendship they might have consciously shared had his mind been able to accept reality. He mourned for Mike's patient persistence in the face of continual rejection and forgetting. But perhaps most painfully, he mourned for himself, for the man he might have been had he been able to integrate the truth, for the healing that might have come through genuine reconnection rather than isolation. Spirit moved beside him, the Mustang's warm body pressing against Jack's shoulder as he knelt in the grass. The horse's presence was solid and reassuring, offering silent strength as the old soldier finally confronted the complex truth his mind had refused to accept for decades. There was something profoundly comforting about the animal's steady companionship. No judgment, no expectation, simply present witness to human suffering. When Jack's tears finally subsided, leaving him emptied yet somehow lighter, he remained kneeling in the grass, one trembling hand resting on the carved wooden marker. Spirit hadn't moved from his position, standing vigil beside him like a silent guardian from some ancient warrior tradition. "He sent you to find me, didn't he?" Jack asked the horse, not feeling foolish at all for expecting some form of understanding from this remarkable animal. "He knew I'd finally be ready. What changed, I wonder? Why now, after all these years?" Spirit bobbed his head in a gesture so human-like that Jack felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun. The movement seemed deliberate, an actual response rather than random animal behavior, reinforcing Jack's growing sense that this Mustang possessed an intelligence or awareness that transcended ordinary equine capabilities. "How long?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "How long has he been gone?" The Mustang, of course, had no way to answer this specific question, but Jack found himself studying the gravesite more carefully, searching for clues about its age and history. The wooden marker showed significant weathering consistent with exposure to several years of Montana's harsh, seasonal cycles. But the ground before it had been kept clear of weeds and debris. Someone had been tending this grave, and relatively recently, judging by the freshly trimmed grass and arranged wildflowers. The sun shifted position slightly, its angle changing to illuminate something Jack hadn't noticed before. Embedded in the earth near the marker, partially concealed by ornamental grasses, was a small metal plaque professionally engraved rather than hand-carved. He gently brushed aside the obscuring vegetation and cleared away a light covering of soil to reveal a simple inscription: Michael James Hansen, 1947-2019. He found his way home, 5 years. Mike had been gone for 5 years while Jack had continued his solitary existence, completely unaware that the friend he'd mourned for half a century had been living nearby, had repeatedly reached out to him, and had finally died within miles of his cabin. The realization cut deeper than any physical wound he'd received in combat, a pain so profound it transcended ordinary grief. 5 years too late, Jack murmured bitterly, running his weathered fingertips over the engraved letters as if trying to connect with what they represented. Story of my life, always too late, too slow, too broken to get it right. Spirit snorted loudly and nudged Jack's shoulder with his muzzle, the contact firmer this time, almost disapproving in its forcefulness. Jack looked up at the horse in surprise, momentarily distracted from his self-recrimination. "You disagree, do you?" he asked, finding it increasingly natural to converse with the animal as if expecting genuine exchange. "Think I'm being too hard on myself?" The Mustang's liquid brown eyes held his gaze steadily, conveying what Jack could only interpret as patient determination. After a moment, Spirit nudged the scattered contents of the metal box that had spilled onto the grass, photographs, journal, papers, as if indicating their importance. "You're right," Jack acknowledged, surprising himself with how natural it felt to interpret the horse's actions as meaningful communication. "It's not too late to know the truth. To remember what I can. To honor what he tried to do, even if I couldn't recognize it then." Jack began carefully gathering the spilled items, treating each photograph and document with reverent care as he returned them to the protective container. His movements were deliberate and mindful, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had characterized his earlier exploration. This was no longer about desperate discovery, but about respectful preservation of a shared history he was only beginning to understand. When everything was safely restored to the ammunition box, Jack retrieved it from the ground and settled himself more comfortably at the base of the ancient oak tree. He leaned his tired back against its sturdy trunk, feeling somehow connected to Mike through this tree that had stood watch over his final resting place. Spirit grazed nearby in the lush glade grass, always keeping Jack in sight, as the aging veteran opened the journal again and began to read more systematically from the beginning. The earliest entries dated from 1975, shortly after Mike had returned to the States following his escape from captivity and subsequent debriefing, medical treatment, and official reinstatement as a living veteran rather than a casualty of war. He described his shock upon learning that the narrow footpath wound its way through ancient pines, their towering presence creating a natural cathedral of dappled light and deep shadow. As Jack followed Spirit deeper into this unfamiliar section of forest, he was struck by the deliberate nature of the path beneath his feet. Unlike game trails that meander according to animal instinct, or hastily cleared human paths that prioritize efficiency over harmony with the landscape, this pathway had been created with care and intention. Someone had maintained it over years, clearing fallen branches and guiding its gentle curves around the most majestic of the old-growth trees rather than removing them. The forest floor on either side of the path was carpeted with emerald moss and clusters of small woodland flowers that had somehow persisted beyond their usual summer blooming period. The scent of pine resin hung heavy in the cooling late afternoon air, mingling with the earthy fragrance of decomposing leaves and the subtle sweetness of wild mushrooms growing in the shadow of a fallen log. These sensory details registered in Jack's awareness with unusual clarity, as if his mind, overwhelmed by the revelations contained in Mike's letter and journal, had temporarily shifted its focus to these immediate, tangible elements of the world around him. Jack realized that Spirit had adjusted his pace perfectly to accommodate his halting gait, the Mustang somehow sensing exactly when to slow down as the path inclined slightly upward or when Jack's knees sent particularly sharp warnings of protest. There was something uncannily deliberate about the horse's movements, a conscious consideration that seemed beyond normal animal behavior. Then again, nothing about this day had fallen within the boundaries of normalcy. As they walked, Jack found his thoughts returning to one of the journal entries he'd glimpsed, a passage where Mike had described finding Spirit with a badly broken leg in 1988. According to what he'd read, local veterinarians had recommended euthanizing the wounded Mustang, seeing no way for a wild horse to recover from such a severe injury. But Mike had refused, perhaps recognizing in the animal's desperate situation a reflection of his own improbable survival against overwhelming odds. Jack wondered what that rehabilitation process must have looked like. A traumatized war veteran nursing an equally traumatized wild animal back to health, each mistrusting the world yet somehow forging a connection that transcended their respective suffering. Had that shared experience of pain and recovery created the extraordinary bond evident in Spirit's behavior now? Had Mike somehow imbued the horse with his own devotion to a friend who couldn't remember him? These questions accompanied Jack as the path suddenly opened into a small, sunlit glade. The transition from the forest's filtered light to this perfectly circular clearing was so abrupt that Jack momentarily halted, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the brightness. The glade was unlike anything he might have expected to find naturally occurring in these mountains. Too symmetrical, too perfectly maintained to be anything but deliberately created and tended over many years. Wildflowers dotted the grass in profusion, creating a living tapestry of purple asters, white yarrow, and the golden faces of late-blooming black-eyed Susans. Birdsong filled the air with a melodic counterpoint to the gentle rustling of oak leaves stirred by the light afternoon breeze. The entire space radiated tranquility, as if someone had somehow distilled the essence of peace itself and infused it into this hidden sanctuary. At the center of this remarkable glade, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree whose massive trunk must have witnessed centuries of human history, stood a simple wooden marker. Even from the edge of the clearing, Jack could see that this was no hastily erected memorial, but a carefully crafted monument created by someone with considerable woodworking skill and deep emotional investment. Spirit moved forward without hesitation, clearly familiar with this place, but Jack found himself suddenly rooted to the spot. Some part of him, perhaps the same psychological mechanism that had allegedly erased his memories of Mike for decades, resisted taking those final steps, as if approaching that marker would make irrefutable what his mind still struggled to accept despite the evidence he'd already encountered. "This is really happening, isn't it?" he whispered, the words barely audible even to himself. He was alive all this time, and now he's truly gone. Spirit turned back to look at him, the Mustang's expressive eyes somehow conveying both patience and gentle encouragement. The horse took a few steps back toward Jack, then waited, his very stillness an invitation to continue when ready. Drawing a deep breath that carried the mingled scents of grass, wildflowers, and distant approaching rain, Jack forced himself forward. Each step across the sunlit glade felt simultaneously like an eternity and an instant, time itself becoming fluid and unreliable around him, much like his own memories, apparently. As he drew nearer to the memorial, details emerged that confirmed this was no ordinary grave marker. The wooden structure had been crafted from a single piece of cedar, its natural reddish hue deepened by years of careful oiling that had preserved it against the elements. Standing approximately 3 feet tall, the marker had been shaped with artistry that transformed utilitarian purpose into something approaching sculpture. No name or dates had been carved into its surface, at least not in the conventional manner of cemetery headstones. Instead, with painstaking precision and obvious reverence, someone had created a bas-relief carving of a pair of wings, the unmistakable insignia of their airborne unit in Vietnam. The wings had been inlaid with what appeared to be tarnished silver wire that caught the afternoon sunlight, creating a subtle luminescence against the darker wood. The level of detail in the carving spoke of days or perhaps weeks of dedicated work. Each feather had been individually rendered, the varying depths of carving creating shadows that enhanced the three-dimensional effect. At the center of the wings, where a parachute would normally be depicted in the official insignia, the artist had instead carved a small flame, perhaps representing spirit or eternal life, though Jack could only speculate about its intended symbolism. The craftsmanship was exceptional, particularly considering it had been created in a remote cabin rather than a properly equipped woodworking shop. Jack found himself wondering if Mike had always possessed such skill, or if this was something he'd developed during his years of isolation, another form of therapy for hands and mind that had known too much destruction. The ground around the marker had been maintained with obvious care. No weeds or random saplings had been allowed to encroach upon this sacred space. Someone had edged the area immediately surrounding the memorial with smooth river stones arranged in a perfect circle, their varied colors of gray, white, and rust red creating a natural boundary between the grave itself and the surrounding wildflowers. Jack stood before this testament to his friend, the metal ammunition box clutched against his chest like a shield, as understanding dawned with a cold certainty that seeped into his bones like November rain. The evidence assembled itself in his mind with inescapable clarity, the letter in Mike's handwriting, yet placed recently on the cabin table, the journal documenting decades of interactions Jack couldn't remember, the photographs showing shared moments that had been systematically erased from his consciousness, and now this grave, clearly established years ago, yet lovingly maintained. The truth was undeniable. Mike Hansen, his brother in all but blood, the man whose death he had mourned for half a century, had survived Vietnam, had somehow returned to the States after years in captivity, had discovered Jack's self-imposed exile and built his own sanctuary nearby, had repeatedly reached out across the decades, only to be forgotten each time due to some psychological mechanism beyond Jack's control or comprehension. And now Mike was gone, truly gone, with only spirit left to bridge the gap between them. The final messenger carrying out one last mission to reconnect two old soldiers separated not by distance, but by the fractured landscape of trauma and memory. "No," he whispered, the metal box suddenly heavy as lead in his arms. "No, no, no." His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, thin and broken, like the cracked bell of a church long abandoned. The weight of revelation, its implications for everything Jack had believed about his life, crashed over him with the force of a tidal wave. His legs, already weakened by age and injury, gave way beneath him, and he fell to his knees before the grave of his friend. The metal ammunition box tumbled forgotten from his grasp, spilling its precious contents onto the grass, photographs capturing moments he couldn't remember living, the journal chronicling a friendship that had persisted despite being continually erased, Mike's dog tags that now hung alongside Jack's own against his chest. These physical evidences of an alternative history lay scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known needed solving. 50 years of complex grief, guilt, and loss broke free from whatever emotional dam had contained them, erupting in wrenching sobs that echoed through the silent glade. The sound seemed to startle a nearby mourning dove, which took flight with a distinctive whistling of wings, its departure momentarily drawing Jack's tear-blurred gaze upward to the vast blue sky above. "I'm sorry," he gasped between heaving breaths, the words insufficient, yet all he had to offer. "God, Mike, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't remember." As the words left his lips, a memory surfaced with surprising clarity, not from Vietnam, but from his childhood in Montana. He'd been perhaps 10 years old, exploring the creek behind his family's modest farmhouse, when he'd discovered a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree during a thunderstorm the previous night. 3 tiny, featherless chicks lay dead beside their shattered home, but a fourth still moved weakly, its translucent skin revealing the frantic beating of its miniature heart. He'd carefully carried the survivor home, fashioning a makeshift nest from an old wool hat and attempting to feed the orphaned bird with an eyedropper, as instructed by his mother. For 3 days, he'd maintained a vigil over the tiny creature, waking throughout the night to offer food and warmth. On the morning of the 4th day, he'd awakened to find the chick motionless, its valiant struggle finally ended despite his desperate efforts. His father had found him weeping behind the barn, clutching the small bundle to his chest. Instead of dismissing his grief with platitudes about just a bird or "that's nature's way," the older man had knelt beside him and said words that had stayed with Jack ever since. "Sometimes, son, trying with all your heart isn't enough to change the outcome. That doesn't mean that trying wasn't worth doing." Now kneeling before Mike's grave, those words returned to him across the decades. According to the journal, Mike had tried repeatedly to reconnect with him, never giving up despite Jack's inability to retain those connections in his conscious memory. The trying hadn't changed the ultimate outcome. They had remained separated by the impenetrable barrier of Jack's psychological condition, but perhaps it had been worth doing nonetheless. Had some part of Jack known, even unconsciously, that Mike was watching over him? Had some fragment of those forgotten interactions provided comfort or stability, even as his conscious mind rejected their reality? These questions had no immediate answers, but they somehow eased the sharp edge of his grief, transforming it into something more complex but slightly less devastating. Spirit moved beside him, the Mustang's warm body pressing against Jack's shoulder as he knelt in the grass. The horse's presence was solid and reassuring, offering silent strength as the old soldier confronted the truth his mind had apparently refused to accept for decades. There was something profoundly comforting about the animal's steady companionship. No judgment, no expectation, simply present witness to human suffering. Jack found himself instinctively leaning into that warm support, his hand reaching up to rest on Spirit's muscular neck. The contact grounded him, providing an anchor point as emotions continued to wash through him in unpredictable waves. The horse remained perfectly still, seeming to understand exactly what was needed in that moment. Not movement or distraction, but simply unwavering presence. When Jack's tears finally subsided, leaving him emotionally exhausted yet somehow lighter, he remained kneeling in the grass, one trembling hand resting on the carved wooden marker. Spirit hadn't moved from his supportive position, standing vigil beside him like a silent guardian from some ancient warrior tradition. "He sent you to find me, didn't he?" Jack asked the horse, not feeling foolish at all for expecting some form of understanding from this remarkable animal. "He knew I'd finally be ready." "What changed, I wonder? Why now, after all these years?" Spirit bobbed his head in a gesture so human-like that Jack felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the late afternoon sun. The movement seemed deliberate, an actual response rather than random animal behavior, reinforcing Jack's growing sense that this Mustang possessed an intelligence or awareness that transcended ordinary equine capabilities. "How long?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "How long has he been gone?" The Mustang, of course, had no way to answer this specific question, but Jack found himself studying the gravesite more carefully, searching for clues about its age and history. The wooden marker showed significant weathering consistent with exposure to several years of Montana's harsh seasonal cycles. But the ground before it had been kept clear of weeds and debris. Someone had been tending this grave, and relatively recently, judging by the freshly trimmed grass and arranged wildflowers. A flutter of movement caught Jack's eye, a monarch butterfly, its orange and black wings luminous in the slanting sunlight, landing delicately on the wooden marker. Its presence seemed improbable given the advancing season and elevation. Yet there it was, wings opening and closing slowly as if taking momentary rest during a long migration. Jack watched, mesmerized, as the beautiful insect explored the carved surface before taking flight again, circling once around his head and then disappearing into the forest canopy. His grandmother would have called such an unexpected visitor a messenger from beyond, a brief bridge between worlds. Jack had never been particularly superstitious, but something about the butterfly's timing in this already surreal day gave him pause. Had it been mere coincidence or something more meaningful? He found himself surprisingly open to possibilities he would have dismissed as fanciful nonsense just hours earlier. As the butterfly vanished from sight, the angle of the sun shifted slightly, its rays illuminating something Jack hadn't noticed before. Embedded in the earth near the marker, partially concealed by ornamental grasses, was a small metal plaque professionally engraved rather than hand-carved. He gently brushed aside the obscuring vegetation and cleared away a light covering of soil to reveal a simple inscription: Michael James Hansen, 1947, 2019. He found his way home, 5 years. Mike had been gone for 5 years, while Jack had continued his solitary existence, completely unaware that the friend he'd mourned for half a century had been living nearby, had repeatedly reached out to him, and had finally died within miles of his cabin. The realization cut deeper than any physical wound he'd received in combat, a pain so profound it transcended ordinary grief. 5 years too late, Jack murmured bitterly, running his weathered fingertips over the engraved letters as if trying to connect with what they represented. Story of my life, always too late, too slow, too broken to get it right. The words tasted acrid on his tongue, familiar companions from decades of self-recrimination. How many times had he replayed moments from Vietnam, imagining alternate scenarios where he'd been faster, smarter, better? How many nights had he lain awake reconstructing the ambush that had supposedly taken Mike's life, envisioning ways he might have prevented it? These mental exercises in alternate history had been pointless torture, even when he'd believed Mike had died in that jungle. Now, with the knowledge that his friend had survived only to die while Jack remained oblivious to his presence, the sense of failure was almost unbearable. Spirit snorted loudly and nudged Jack's shoulder with his muzzle, the contact firmer this time, almost disapproving in its forcefulness. Jack looked up at the horse in surprise, momentarily distracted from his spiral of self-recrimination. "You disagree, do you?" he asked, finding it increasingly natural to converse with the animal as if expecting genuine exchange. "Think I'm being too hard on myself?" The Mustang's liquid brown eyes held his gaze steadily, conveying what Jack could only interpret as patient determination. After a moment, Spirit nudged the scattered contents of the metal box that had spilled onto the grass, photographs, journal, papers, as if indicating their importance. "You're right," Jack acknowledged, surprising himself with how natural it felt to interpret the horse's actions as meaningful communication. "It's not too late to know the truth, to remember what I can, to honor what he tried to do, even if I couldn't recognize it then." As he spoke these words, Jack realized they contained a truth he hadn't consciously formulated until that moment. While he couldn't change the past or recover the lost decades of conscious friendship with Mike, he could still honor that friendship by acknowledging it now, by accepting the reality of what had happened, by carrying forward whatever understanding he could glean from the materials Mike had left behind. Jack began carefully gathering the spilled items, treating each photograph and document with reverent care as he returned them to the protective container. His movements were deliberate and mindful, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had characterized his earlier exploration. This was no longer about desperate discovery, but about respectful preservation of a shared history he was only beginning to understand. When everything was safely restored to the ammunition box, Jack retrieved it from the ground and settled himself more comfortably at the base of the ancient oak tree. He leaned his tired back against its sturdy trunk, feeling somehow connected to Mike through this tree that had stood watch over his final resting place. Spirit grazed nearby in the lush glade grass, always keeping Jack in sight, as the aging veteran opened the journal again and began to read more systematically from the beginning. The earliest entries dated from 1975, shortly after Mike had returned to the States following his escape from captivity and subsequent debriefing, medical treatment, and official reinstatement as a living veteran rather than a casualty of war. He described his shock upon learning that Jack had withdrawn completely from society after multiple failed attempts to reintegrate into civilian life. "Finally tracked Jack down today after months of dead ends and bureaucratic stonewalling," one early entry read. "He's living in a trailer on the outskirts of Bozeman, working odd construction jobs when his knee allows it. The local VA office reluctantly provided his address after I presented proof of my identity and our shared service history. They warned me he's unstable, their clinical term for a man whose soul has been shattered by what we were asked to do and witness. I watched his trailer from a distance for hours, trying to work up the courage to approach. When he finally emerged in late afternoon, the sight nearly broke me. This gaunt, limping stranger with haunted eyes bears little resemblance to the Jack Miller I knew, the philosophy student who could recite Whitman from memory, who planned to teach literature after the war, who maintained his humanity in the most inhumane conditions through sheer force of will. I meant to approach him then, to reveal myself and offer whatever comfort my survival might provide. But watching him move so cautiously through the world, handling ordinary objects as if they might explode, scanning rooftops and alleyways for threats that exist only in memory, I realized my sudden appearance might cause more harm than good. The doctors warned me about shock, about how trauma can reshape the brain's ability to process certain information. I need to be strategic about this reunion, for his sake more than mine. So I retreated unseen to devise a better approach. Tonight I'll contact Dr. Matthews at Walter Reed. He treated both of us at different times and might have insights about how to proceed. Jack deserves healing, not another psychological ambush, no matter how well-intentioned. The compassion evident in these early entries touched Jack deeply. Even then, newly returned from his own traumatic captivity, Mike's primary concern had been for his friend's well-being. He'd approached the situation with characteristic thoughtfulness, seeking professional guidance rather than risking harm through impulsive action. Subsequent entries detailed Mike's careful attempts to reconnect, guided by the psychiatric professionals he'd consulted. He'd initially tried writing letters, but they were returned unopened. He had called Jack's sporadic employers only to be told that Jack had quit or been fired for erratic behavior. He'd even enlisted the help of a mutual acquaintance from their unit, but Jack had apparently become suspicious and threatened violence when the man mentioned Mike's name. Finally, nearly a year after his return, Mike had made direct contact. The journal entry describing this first reunion spans several pages, the handwriting varying between Mike's usual careful script and more hurried passages that suggested heightened emotion during the writing. I did it. After months of planning and false starts, I finally spoke to Jack face-to-face today. I followed him to a small diner where he apparently has breakfast every Tuesday, waited until he'd ordered, then approached his booth with my heart threatening to burst from my chest. He didn't recognize me at first, not surprising given my changed appearance in the context. When I said his name, he looked up with that thousand-yard stare that's become so familiar among our kind. I sat down uninvited and simply said, "It's me, Jack. It's Mike Hansen." The transformation was extraordinary, like watching a statue come to life. His eyes focused, truly seeing me perhaps for the first time. Color returned to his face. His hands began to shake so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of his cup. "Mike," he whispered, as if saying my name might make me disappear. "But you're dead." "They told me. I saw." I explained everything, the ambush, my capture, the prison camp, my escape. He listened with absolute attention, asking occasional questions that proved he was tracking the narrative. When I finished, he reached across the table and gripped my arm so tightly it'll probably bruise, as if physically anchoring me to reality. "I mourned you," he said, voice breaking. "Every day for 5 years, I've carried your death like a stone in my chest." We talked for hours, the waitress refilling our coffee cups with diminishing patience. Jack told me about his struggles since returning, the failed marriage, the jobs he couldn't keep, the nightmares that never stopped. But there was something different about him as we talked. A spark returning to his eyes. A slight relaxation in his perpetually tense posture. He even laughed at one point, a rusty sound, as if long unused but genuine. When we finally left the diner, we made plans to meet again the following day. He hugged me before we parted, a fierce embrace that seemed to express everything words couldn't. I drove away feeling more hopeful than I have since before the war. Perhaps this is the beginning of healing for both of us. Jack paused in his reading, trying to reconcile this account with his complete absence of memory regarding such a significant event. How could he possibly have forgotten reuniting with Mike? The emotional impact described would surely have been memorable, potentially life-changing. Yet he had no recollection whatsoever of this diner meeting or any subsequent interaction. The next entry in the journal, dated just 2 days later, provided the devastating answer. It happened exactly as Dr. Matthews warned it might. I arrived at Jack's trailer at the agreed-upon time, bringing the old photographs I'd promised to show him. He answered the door with a shotgun, demanding to know who I was and what I wanted. There wasn't the slightest glimmer of recognition in his eyes, only suspicion and barely contained panic. When I said my name, he became agitated, insisting that Mike Hansen had died in Vietnam and that I was either confused or running some kind of scam. When I persisted, showing him the same photographs I'd mentioned during our diner conversation, he became increasingly distraught, finally ordering me off his property with the shotgun raised. I retreated immediately, not wanting to escalate the situation. Once back in my car, I called Dr. Matthews from a payphone. He wasn't surprised. He explained that Jack appears to be suffering from a severe form of dissociative amnesia specifically triggered by my reappearance. The trauma of believing he'd lost me, combined with his own war experiences, created a psychological defense mechanism that simply refuses to integrate information contradicting his established narrative. In layman's terms, his mind literally cannot accept that I'm alive without threatening the fragile stability he's managed to construct. When presented with irrefutable evidence of my survival, his brain simply erases the encounter rather than restructuring his entire understanding of reality. The doctor warned that pushing too hard could trigger a complete psychological break. He recommended patience, periodic gentle attempts at reconnection, and acceptance that full recovery might never be possible. The mind protects itself in mysterious ways, he said, Sometimes the protection itself becomes the prison. So where does this leave us? I refuse to abandon Jack to his isolation, but I can't force him to remember me without risking greater harm. For now, I'll watch over him from a distance, looking for opportunities to help without triggering his defenses. Perhaps time will heal what direct intervention cannot. As Jack continued reading, the journal documented a heartbreaking pattern that repeated over the subsequent decades. Mike would find ways to carefully reintroduce himself, sometimes achieving brief connections that lasted hours or occasionally even days. During these periods, Jack would apparently recognize and interact with Mike normally, even forming new memories of their time together. But inevitably, something would trigger the amnesia again, often when Mike left his presence even briefly. And upon his return, Jack would have no recollection of their renewed friendship. Mike had consulted numerous specialists over the years, trying different therapeutic approaches based on evolving understanding of trauma and memory. He'd attempted everything from gradually introducing familiar objects from their shared past to creating new positive experiences unconnected to Vietnam. He'd even arranged for Jack to receive specialized psychiatric treatment under various pretexts, though these efforts had rarely succeeded given Jack's deep distrust of mental health professionals. Through it all, Mike had maintained a patient dedication that astounded Jack as he read. Where most people would have eventually given up in the face of continuous rejection and forgetting, Mike had persisted for decades, never abandoning hope that his friend might someday break through the psychological barriers separating them. The journal also revealed that Mike had been responsible for numerous coincidences and instances of good luck that Jack had experienced over the years. The job offer that had brought him to Montana initially, the suspiciously reasonable price of the land where he'd built his cabin, the anonymous donation to cover his medical bills after a particularly serious bout of pneumonia, all had been orchestrated by Mike, working behind the scenes to protect his friend while respecting the boundaries created by his condition. Most moving were the entries describing how Spirit had unexpectedly become a bridge between them. The most remarkable thing has happened. An entry from 1989 read, Spirit, now fully recovered from his leg injury and free to come and go as he pleases, has taken to visiting Jack on his own initiative. I discovered this by accident when following the horse's tracks after one of his frequent disappearances. To my astonishment, the tracks led directly to Jack's cabin. When I cautiously approached, staying hidden among the trees, I witnessed something extraordinary. Jack was sitting on his porch talking to Spirit as if they were old friends. The horse stood quietly, occasionally nodding his head as if understanding every word. I watched for nearly an hour as Jack spoke more words than I've heard from him in months, sharing thoughts with this supposedly wild Mustang that he's never been able to express to another human. Even more remarkably, when I later approached the cabin myself after Spirit had departed, Jack reverted to his typical suspicious behavior, showing no recognition of me whatsoever. For reasons I cannot begin to explain, Jack's amnesia doesn't extend to Spirit. He consistently remembers the horse from one encounter to the next, developing what appears to be a genuine friendship with him despite being unable to maintain human connections. Levine suggests this might be because Spirit doesn't trigger the trauma response associated with my resurrection. The horse represents no contradiction to Jack's established reality and thus poses no threat to his psychological stability. Whatever the explanation, I'm grateful. If I cannot reach Jack directly, perhaps Spirit can provide some of the connection he so desperately needs, but cannot accept from human sources. There's something almost mystical about watching them together, as if the horse understands his role as intermediary between two separated friends. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the peaceful glade, Jack closed the journal temporarily. His mind needed time to process what he'd learned, to begin integrating this alternative history into his understanding of his own life. The task seemed both impossible and necessary, a paradox that perfectly encapsulated the situation Mike had faced for decades. Spirit had returned to stand near him, the Mustang's presence a comforting constant amid the shifting sands of memory and reality. Jack reached up to touch the horse's muzzle, feeling the soft warmth of breath against his palm. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he said softly. "You've been the thread connecting us across years I can't remember, carrying messages I couldn't hear directly." Spirit's gentle nickering seemed almost like agreement, though Jack recognized he might be projecting human understanding onto animal behavior. Then again, after everything he'd learned today, He found himself increasingly open to possibilities that extended beyond conventional explanation. Perhaps there were forms of connection and communication that transcended ordinary understanding, bonds that persisted even when conscious memory failed. As the coolness of approaching evening began to settle over the glade, Jack felt a strange peace stealing over him, despite the emotional upheaval of the day's discoveries. There was a certain liberation in finally knowing the truth, however painful, in understanding that he hadn't been as alone as he'd believed all these years. Someone had been watching over him, caring about his welfare, attempting repeatedly to reconnect despite continuous rejection. That knowledge couldn't erase the decades of isolation or recover the conscious friendship they might have shared, but it changed something fundamental about Jack's perception of his life. The narrative he'd constructed of the abandoned, forgotten veteran whose only true friend had died in Vietnam required revision in light of this new information. He had been loved, had been valued, had been worth extraordinary effort and patience, even when he couldn't recognize or acknowledge it. As twilight began to soften the forest's edges, Jack carefully repacked the journal and other spilled contents into the ammunition box. There would be time for further reading later, for deeper exploration of the complex history documented in those pages. For now, he needed to return to shelter before darkness made navigation difficult, even with Spirit's guidance. With the Mustang's patient assistance, Jack struggled back to his feet, his stiff knee protesting after so long kneeling on the ground. He stood for a moment before the wooden marker, feeling he should say something, some acknowledgement of all he'd learned, some promise to the friend who had never abandoned him despite his inability to remember. "I hear you now, Mike," he finally said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "I don't know how much I'll remember tomorrow or the next day. I don't know if whatever broke in my mind can ever truly heal. But right now, in this moment, I know you were here. I know you tried. And I'm grateful beyond words." He placed his weathered hand on the carved wings that had once symbolized their shared military brotherhood and now represented a different kind of bond, one that had transcended death, trauma, forgetting, and finally death again. The connection felt tangible beneath his palm, as real as the wooden marker itself. With a final nod of respect, Jack turned away from the grave, tucking the ammunition box securely under his arm. Spirit stood waiting at the edge of the glade, his powerful silhouette backlit by the golden light of the setting sun. Together they began the journey back through the deepening forest shadows, two survivors united by memories. Some shared, some forgotten, but all part of a story that was still unfolding. More comfortably at the base of the oak tree, his back against its sturdy trunk. Spirit grazed nearby, always keeping Jack in sight, as the aging veteran opened the journal again and began to read more systematically. The earliest entries dated from 1975, shortly after Mike had returned to the States and discovered Jack's isolation. The most recent was from just weeks before Mike's death in 2019. Between them lay a chronicle of a friendship that refused to be destroyed by war, by trauma, by Jack's fractured memory. As the sun moved across the sky, Jack read about Mike's struggles with his own PTSD, his decision to build the cabin near Jack's property, his attempts to reconnect with his friend. He read about Spirit, how Mike had found the young Mustang with a badly broken leg in 1988, how the local vet had recommended putting the animal down, how Mike had insisted on trying to save him. "The way that horse looked at me," one entry read, "I swear he knew exactly what I was thinking. That I saw myself in him, broken, written off, but still fighting. I couldn't let them put him down. Couldn't be complicit in another death." The journal described Spirit's remarkable recovery and the unique bond that formed between horse and man. Mike had never attempted to fully domesticate Spirit, instead establishing a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. The Mustang came and went freely, sometimes disappearing for days only to return as if he'd never left. Most striking were the entries describing how Spirit had independently sought out Jack during particularly difficult periods, as if the horse could somehow sense when Jack was struggling with his darkest memories. Mike wrote about watching from a distance as Spirit approached Jack's cabin, how Jack, who allowed no one else near him, would talk to the Mustang for hours. "It's as if Spirit can reach a part of Jack that I can't," one entry observed. "He doesn't trigger the amnesia or the defensive reactions. Jack recognizes him each time, remembers him. I admit I've been jealous of that, but mostly I'm grateful. At least some part of me, through Spirit, can still help my friend." As evening approached, Jack closed the journal, his mind overwhelmed with information, but his heart oddly peaceful. The pieces were falling into place, the gaps in his memory, the strange sense of familiarity he'd always felt with Spirit, the recurring dreams of conversations that seemed too real to be mere imagination. He never gave up on me, Jack said to Spirit, who had returned to stand beside him as the light began to fade. Even when I didn't know him. The Mustang lowered his head to gently nudge the metal box, then looked at Jack expectantly. "There's more?" Jack asked, opening the box again. Beneath where the journal had been lay a sealed envelope with "For Jack, read last," written across it in Mike's distinctive handwriting. With fingers that had steadied significantly since morning, Jack opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The date at the top was January 17th, 2019. Just 3 months before Mike's death, according to the grave marker. "Jack, if you're reading this, two things have happened. I've finally gone to whatever peace awaits old soldiers like us, and Spirit has succeeded in bringing you here. I always believed he would, when the time was right. The doctors gave me 6 months a year ago, so I've already beaten the odds. Cancer. Agent Orange's final joke, I suppose. A lot of us who came back are dealing with it now. The war's last ambush. I want you to know that I never blamed you for not remembering me. The psychiatrist I saw in the VA hospital explained it to me. Dissociative amnesia, they called it. Your mind protecting itself from further trauma. Seeing me alive brought back everything from that day. Everything you'd managed to lock away to survive. So your brain simply refused to record the new memories. Erase them as soon as I was out of sight. I tried everything I could think of to help you break through. Different approaches, different settings. Once I even brought you to this cabin while you were in one of your dissociative states. You stayed for 3 days, seemed to be improving, recognizing me a little more each day. Then you went for a walk alone, and when you returned, it was all gone again. You pulled your gun on me, told me to get out of your cabin. After that, I kept my distance more, watched over you from afar. But I never stopped visiting, never stopped trying. The photographs in the box are proof of that. Little moments I managed to capture during the good times, when you would let me near, before the amnesia reclaimed you. Spirit was the bridge between us. That horse understood what was happening before I did. He would visit you when I couldn't, seemed to know exactly when you needed someone. You never forgot him, never reacted badly to him. I think because he came to you with no expectations, no shared past to trigger the defenses your mind had built. In my last few months, I've been preparing him. Don't ask me how I know it would work, but somehow I was certain that after I was gone, he would bring you here when you were finally ready to remember. Animals sense these things in ways we can't understand. There's a key taped to the back of this letter. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in town. Inside is everything I own. The deed to this land, my savings, and something I've been working on for decades. Call it my legacy if you want to be generous, or my obsession if you're feeling less charitable. I've spent the last 30 years documenting the stories of Vietnam veterans. Men like us who came home to a country that didn't want to hear what they'd been through. I've recorded interviews, collected letters and photographs, tracked down families of those who didn't make it back. I couldn't save everyone, Jack, but I could make sure they weren't forgotten. It's yours now. All of it. Do with it what you think is right. I have only one request. Take care of Spirit. He's more than just a horse. He carried me through the darkest times when I couldn't bear the weight alone. Let him do the same for you, now that I can't be there. Remember this, brother. Surviving is just the beginning. It's what you do with the life you fought so hard to keep that matters. Until we meet again on the other side, Mike P.S. Check the loose floorboard by the fireplace. I left something there for you. Something I've been saving for a day I always hoped would come. Jack lowered the letter, a strange calm settling over him despite the emotional turmoil of the day. He looked at Spirit, who stood sentinel-like in the fading light, his coat turned to burnished gold by the setting sun. Looks like you're stuck with me now, Jack said, his voice rough but steady. That okay with you? The Mustang nickered softly, stepping forward to rest his muzzle against Jack's shoulder in a gesture that needed no interpretation. As darkness began to claim the forest, Jack pushed himself to his feet, gathering the metal box in one arm while leaning on his cane with the other. Let's go back to the cabin, he said to Spirit. We've got a loose floorboard to find. Night had fallen by the time Jack and Spirit returned to the cabin. The temperature had dropped considerably, and Jack shivered in his light jacket, regretting not bringing warmer clothing. He hadn't planned on being out all day when he'd followed the Mustang that morning. Spirit seemed to sense his discomfort. The horse nudged him toward the cabin's entrance with gentle insistence, then took up position near the porch, clearly intending to remain outside. "You're not coming in?" Jack asked, pausing at the threshold. The Mustang shook his head in a distinctly human-like gesture that Jack might have found unsettling, if not for everything else he'd experienced that day. "All right then, but don't wander off." Inside, Jack fumbled in the growing darkness until he located the kerosene lamp on the table. His hands remembered the motions from years of power outages at his own cabin, checking the oil level, trimming the wick, striking a match. The lamp cast a warm golden glow that pushed back the shadows, revealing the cabin in greater detail than he'd noticed during his earlier shock. Evidence of Mike's personality was everywhere. Books on the shelves ranging from classic literature to military history, a chess set with a game apparently in progress, a guitar propped in the corner. On the walls hung a few framed photographs and a detailed map of the surrounding forest with trails marked in red ink. Jack set the metal box on the table and turned his attention to the fireplace. The night was growing colder, and he needed warmth as much as light. A stack of split wood sat neatly beside the stone hearth, with kindling and matches nearby. Within minutes, Jack had a small fire crackling, the familiar task helping to ground him as his mind continued to process the day's revelations. Only when the fire was burning steadily did he remember the postscript in Mike's letter. He moved to the fireplace, studying the floorboards carefully in the combined light of the fire and lamp. Near the left side of the hearth, one board appeared slightly shorter than the others, with a gap just wide enough to get fingers into. Jack knelt awkwardly, his bad knee protesting after the day's unusual activity. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The board came up easily, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a bottle of bourbon, Maker's Mark, their shared favorite from Vietnam days, in a small wooden box. He set both items on the table and lowered himself into one of the chairs, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The bourbon was dusty but sealed. The box was simple but finely crafted, with no lock or latch, just a snug-fitting lid. Jack decided to open the bourbon first. The familiar smell brought back a flood of memories. Sharing contraband bottles during rare moments of downtime in the war, celebrating their survival after particularly close calls, the last drink they'd shared 2 nights before the ambush. He took a sip directly from the bottle, tradition between old soldiers trumping civility. The smooth burn down his throat was comforting, a tangible connection to the past. Setting the bourbon aside, Jack turned to the wooden box. When he lifted the lid, his breath caught. Inside lay Mike's Purple Heart in a folded American flag in the traditional triangle, along with what looked like a piece of tarnished metal. Jack carefully lifted out the metal object. It was a Zippo lighter, a lighter, the kind every soldier in Vietnam seemed to carry. The front was engraved with their unit insignia, the same wings that marked Mike's grave. Jack turned it over and saw his own initials on the back, JTM. Jack Thomas Miller. It was his lighter. Lighter, the one he'd lost during the ambush, or thought he'd lost. Mike must have found it afterward, kept it all these years. "You sentimental old fool," Jack murmured, but there was no bite to the words, only affection and a profound sense of loss. He flicked the lighter open, not expecting it to work after so many years. To his surprise, it lit on the first try, the flame strong and steady. Mike had maintained it, kept it filled and ready, just as he'd kept watch over Jack from a distance. Outside, Spirit nickered softly. Jack moved to the window and saw the Mustang looking toward the trees, ears pricked forward attentively. A moment later, Jack heard it too, the distinctive sound of an engine laboring up the rough forest road, still some distance away but approaching. Who would be coming here at this hour? Jack wondered. According to everything he'd read, Mike had valued his privacy as much as Jack did, rarely receiving visitors. He slipped the lighter into his pocket and moved to the door, stepping out onto the porch. Spirit had positioned himself between the cabin and the approaching vehicle, his posture alert but not alarmed. Headlights appeared through the tree, bouncing wildly as the vehicle, a truck from the sound of it, navigated the uneven terrain. Finally, an older model Ford pickup emerged into the clearing, its engine cutting off as it came to a stop. Jack tensed, one hand instinctively reaching for the pistol he had left at home. Beside him, Spirit remained calm, which provided some reassurance. The truck's door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, lean, moving with the distinctive grace of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. As he approached, the combined light from the porch and his own flashlight revealed a Native American man, perhaps a decade younger than Jack, with long gray hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. He stopped at the edge of the porch steps, respecting the boundary. His eyes moved from Jack to Spirit and back, a flash of surprise crossing his weathered features. "You must be Jack," he said simply. "I'm Thomas Blackhawk. I was Mike's friend." Chapter 7, Legacy and New Beginnings. Jack studied the man, neither confirming nor denying his identity. Years of isolation had made him cautious with strangers. Thomas seemed to understand. He didn't press for a response, instead turning his attention to Spirit. The Mustang approached him without hesitation, allowing the man to stroke his neck with obvious familiarity. "He brought you here," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Mike said he would someday. Jack's caution gave way slightly to curiosity. "You knew Mike well?" Thomas nodded. "I helped him build this place. Took care of him when he got sick at the end." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "And I've been looking after his grave since he passed. Coming up every few days to clear away leaves, keep the area nice. He's family to me." Jack felt a twinge of guilt. This stranger had been caring for his friend's final resting place, while Jack, who had once been closer to Mike than anyone, hadn't even known he was dead. "Mike talked about you a lot," Thomas continued. "Said you were the bravest man he ever knew." Jack gave a bitter laugh. "Brave? I've been hiding from the world for decades." "Surviving isn't hiding," Thomas replied evenly. Mike understood that better than most. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the soft huffing of Spirit and the crackling of the fire inside the cabin. "I don't mean to intrude," Thomas finally said. "I just saw the light and wanted to check. Nobody's been up here since Mike passed, except me." He hesitated, then added, "I can go, or I can stay and answer any questions you might have. It's your choice." Jack considered the offer. His instinct was to send the man away, return to the solitude he'd grown comfortable with over the years. But something about Thomas's quiet dignity and the obvious trust Spirit placed in him made Jack reconsider.